You don't need bigger goals, you need faster feedback loops. And in today's video, I'm going to be going through the system that makes growth inevitable, which is fast feedback loops, how we're actively thinking about this, and how we're implementing it inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems. And like always, the main mission of these videos is to build the thinking OS, basically Killer Chaos OS, that logs the decisions that we're actively making and also is our problem solving mode that we use in order to build backend systems, and ultimately to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively solving for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So most people obsess over goals, and some build systems through this, but the real edge, in my opinion and my experience that I've seen, is building tighter feedback loops. And one of the things that I've ultimately been, super focused on is ultimately asking, how can I constantly build tighter feedback loops in every single aspect of my life specifically, and also just building this moat around feedback loops, because feedback loops are ultimately what governs how you're able to build into the future. And also understanding that, hey, one of the things that is super important, especially building our backend systems, is ultimately understanding that feedback loops are basically data points, and through those data points we can use this to then refine the machine. And how do we actively do this? This is how we actively do this and think about this, which is breaking it down into these simple stages of saying, hey, number one is picking your North Star, saying, hey, for example, you need to understand what your North Star metric is, which is for sales. We can say, hey, it's not revenue, which is the lagging indicator, but it's rather, calls booked. How many calls are we actively booking, which is your leading indicator to say, hey, the problem isn't necessarily understanding that, hey, we don't have enough revenue. It's then taking a look at how is our sales process looking. Are we actively booking more calls, which ultimately leads to the revenue increasing within our internal sales department, which ultimately understands and underpins how we're able to use these different data points and through this feedback loop and understand that, hey, the lagging indicator is ultimately revenue, but the leading indicator is calls booked. And how do we actively solve for this? We need to understand that, hey, we need to take a first principles approach and understanding that, hey, we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions, because asking the right questions of saying, hey, what is at the core of our sales process, and how can we actively understand that, hey, this is our sales process, this is how we look, how we see it today, and we understand each and every single moving variable, and through this we're then able to understand that, hey, XYZ interacts with Y, and because Y interacts with Y with this, we can understand that they both are interacting with each other, and through that interaction they're able to produce this result, whether it's you not making the revenue targets that you're ultimately making, and also understanding that, hey, the leading indicator is ultimately understanding that, hey, we need to book more calls, and through understanding that we can then build these feedback loops that run off of that, because simply understanding that, hey, we need to build this calls booked mode, which ultimately drives how we're able to print more cash in the bank, or in the business as well, ultimately is what we need to be super focused on. And how do we build the feedback loops that ultimately govern this? We just need to make sure that we're asking the right questions, which ultimately leads into us asking or thinking about building visibility. And through this is what we need to say, hey, the metrics should hit you in the face daily. We need to make sure that each and every single day we are seeing the metric that ultimately we need to hit. If you want to say, hey, you want to increase cash flow to XYZ cash, then ultimately you need to see the metrics that ultimately get you to that North Star metric each and every single day. And through understanding that, hey, I need to see this every single day, it builds in your brain subconsciously that, hey, we need to do this each and every single day. Because I think if you don't see it each and every single day, you ultimately aren't as intent or as obsessed as you should be in order to hit that target. And I've counted and seen myself so many times when I haven't seen one thing that, I've ultimately needed to strive for each and every single day. It sounds, cringe to say, at least, what Napoleon Hill says, that hey, if you have a goal that you want to hit within your mind or within your life, you need to make sure that you're seeing it each and every single day, because subconsciously, it builds that, that mode to say, hey, I need to hit XYZ metric, and this is my North Star. And each and every single day, I need to turn this into reality from just being in my mind. I need to turn it into reality. And also understanding that you need to make it real, basically using whiteboards, dashboards, or even sticky notes, because if it's not visible, it's ultimately not real. Because I think one of the most important things, and it comes from all these self-development books and all these people saying that, hey, if you just write down your goal and then you ultimately look at it each and every single day, subconsciously your mind starts figuring out ways in order to hit that goal. And I think that is a unmatched truth. And also, just building backend systems and ultimately understanding that feedback loops also run off of this, and understanding that, hey, you need to be able to see this metric each and every single day, and understanding that through this you can then build the feedback loops that ultimately allow you to refine the machine in order to get to your North Star metric. But through that, you also need to understand that you need to set a threshold. While this threshold basically, is the minimum that you need to hit, basically the minimum bar that keeps your momentum alive. Basically, this can be 5 outreach messages a day, 2 sales calls per week. Just the small thresholds compound faster than big unsustainable sprints. Just understanding that these small thresholds compound faster than these big unsustainable sprints, because one of the most important things, at least in my personal opinion, is setting small thresholds, and through these small thresholds you start increasing them slightly each and every single week or each and every single month, and through that you build momentum. And I think one of the most important things that you could be doing is building this mode where you're just building these small thresholds that ultimately lead into that compounding effect that ultimately gets you to your goal. And I think this is one of the most important things to understand, that hey, these thresholds are ultimately going to be what builds the momentum that ultimately needs to be kept alive. And through that, we understand that, hey, we need to take the small approach to say one each and every single day, and then we basically compound that, rather than having these big unsustainable sprints, because you will get demoralized most of the time when you see these big, you set out these big unsustainable sprints, and then you run for it for a little while, but then after a short while you figure out that, hey, I cannot sustain this, and this is something that you don't want to do. And I think also asking questions around this is also super important, to ask yourself that, hey, am I constantly setting goals that are ultimately something that I can sustain over the long term, and is it something that I can hold myself accountable to each and every single day? For example, with these daily videos, I said, hey, we're gonna start at one day, one video a day, and then constantly build around that. Now I built this mode that, hey, each and every single day I can just press record, even if I struggle a little bit, like today, I don't know why. But ultimately through that, just understanding that, hey, I need to set this minimum threshold that each and every single day I need to press record, and I need to upload this video each and every single day. And I need to make sure that, hey, this is something that I can sustain over a long run, because through this it's ultimately going to build my moat internally. And I'm super excited, and I want to show that hey, some days I may struggle, I may not be able to communicate in the way that I would like today, but ultimately I'm just going to get it done. No matter what, I'm going to get it done, and I'm going to review and also just make sure that, hey, next video I know where I lacked, and I'm just rewatching and saying, hey, the next video is going to be so much better. But each and every single day I'm just going to ship, and I'm just going to set that as my minimum threshold. And then through that, I'm able to build this momentum where now we're 85 days in, and ultimately I know that we ain't stopping anytime soon. Special announcement when we hit day 100, so stay tuned for that. And then ultimately number 4, which is automating the scorecard or scorekeeping, which basically you're then manually updating sheets. You understand that, hey, if you're updating sheets inputs manually, you need to stop that. You need to pipe your data into into a dashboard, and ultimately understand that by you removing friction, you stay focused on execution. Because I think one of the most important things that you could be doing on a day-to-day basis is ultimately just executing at a high level, and basically understanding that, hey, you can input these datas, you can do all of these manual inputs on a day to day, but ultimately that creates that mental block that you need to focus on, and that mental block that you need to focus on to say, hey, I'm focusing on XYZ. Yes, it's straining 100%, but ultimately that also takes away time that you could be focusing on the three leverage points that you could be pushing on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is something that I need to 100% get better on, to just solely just understand that, hey, what are the three needle movers that I can do today that ultimately drive 10x output, and understanding that and using that on a day-to-day basis, because I think through that is going to ultimately 10x how I'm able to think, and also how I'm able to solve problems, and also lead the team better as well, and also just building cool things, because I think that is ultimately going to be the strategic mode that gets us to the next level, where we're ultimately building cool things and redefining industries, and also inspiring millions of people through Killer Chaos OS. And I think through that we're ultimately just going to need to understand that, hey, we're going to fail, we're going to have bad days, like today, where I just probably am not the best in terms of communicating. Yesterday was a good day, but today is probably not the best in terms of communicating, but also just being upfront to that and saying, hey, like, today is just one of those days, but I'm still gonna stay showing up, and I'm still gonna make sure that I stay in the game a lot longer, and making sure that, hey, each and every single day I'm just going to keep shipping and just keep on iterating and increasing how I'm able to do what it is that I'm doing, and saying, hey, I need to understand that, hey, through these feedback loops, we need to be able to close the loop weekly, basically asking ourselves, did the inputs hit the threshold, basically the thresholds that we have set in step 3, saying, hey, these minimum thresholds, did we hit them, yes or no? If yes, then we keep pushing. If no, then we fix the bottleneck before it compounds, because like I've said in many videos, that, hey, you move as fast as your bottleneck, or as your constraint, and solely just understanding that you as a business are ultimately moving as fast as your slowest or your constraint, and that constraint is your bottleneck. That means you're not moving fast enough, so then you need to solve that constraint in order to move faster, and ultimately understand that once you solve it, you're ultimately able to then compound your leverage, and then saying, hey, goals give you directions, systems create consistency, but feedback loops give you acceleration. They ultimately accelerate what it is that you're actively doing on a day-to-day basis, and through this, because the faster you see, the faster you adjust, and the faster you grow, because speed is everything. And I think speed is just one of those things that you need to have as a minimum threshold, to say, hey, if someone sends me a message, I'm going to respond in 10 minutes or less, and ultimately just understand that each and every single day we need to be consistent in what it is that we're actively doing, and making sure that, hey, we're gonna fail so many times, but the things that we're gonna get right, we're gonna make sure that we're actively just hitting the nail in the wall, and making sure that, hey, through these feedback loops that we're actively building, we're going to understand that, hey, there are going to be times where we're not going to be moving as fast, but how do we take that and fix our constraints in order to move faster? And through that, we're building visibility, we're setting a threshold, and we're automating the scorecard, basically saying, keeping track of what it is that we're actively doing, and keeping score of that through a dashboard, and saying each and every single day we need to make sure that we're seeing this, because feedback loops aren't just about you reaching out and speaking to people, it's about what you're seeing on a day-to-day basis, and through that you're ultimately able to see these metrics, because these metrics are data points, and through these data points you're able to then understand what it is that you need to fix, and also what you need to scale, in order to understand this is the friction point, and how do we remove this friction, and ultimately allow us to stay focused on execution. And through this, just tying it all together with closing out weekly, to say, hey, did we actively just solve what it is that we were solving for? Did we actively move towards our goal? If yes, we keep pushing. If no, then we just understand that, hey, we need to solve for our constraints, because this constraint may compound over time, so how do we stop it before it starts compounding? And one of the things that I've realized is that mostly when it comes to feedback loops, is that compounding, feedback loops and things that happen ultimately come as a result of compounding efforts. And through this compounding efforts, you can say, hey, let's say 1 week you didn't keep track of, your sales metrics. That is ultimately going to snowball. And if you don't solve that constraint right there and then, it's ultimately going to compound. And then you're not going to know what's going to happen when, hey, you're bleeding 200 or whatever the case may be in a month. And you're like, hey, what is going on? Simply because of the constraints that snowballed from that time, and ultimately understanding that, hey, how can we actively build these compounding efforts that ultimately gives us that momentum through time, that ultimately also gets us to where it is that we need to get to. But understanding that, hey, we're gonna fail so many times and we're gonna also succeed, but what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep showing up each and every single day. Today was not probably the best day in terms of recording. I don't know why, but it's just one of those days. But each and every single day, I'm just gonna make sure that I'm pressing record, shipping each and every single day, and showing up, because I think that's the most important mode, even if it's not in the best format. Ultimately, just understanding that that is what the needle movers are gonna be on a day-to-day basis. But through that, we're just gonna build Killer Chaos OS, where we're gonna be with this big picture vision, where we're gonna be redefining industries and also inspiring millions of people. I think that is a future worth getting excited to. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.